Hi everyone, so here we are, and this is the very last piece of the central nervous system lecture, and now we're going to be looking at the spinal cord. So remember, the central nervous system includes the brain and the spinal cord. So let's look at the spinal cord. Let's start with this question here. What body cavity contains the spinal cord? So that's our very first lecture, all the way back at week 1. That would be the vertebral cavity, and the vertebral cavity is created when all of those vertebrae are stacked on top of each other. And remember that the vertebral foramen, the big hole right in the very middle of the vertebrae, when they stack on top of each other, they create that cavity. Okay, so that spinal cord is going to run through there, and then coming off of the spinal cord, that's where you have your spinal nerves. Okay, so you got all these different spinal nerves, and most of the spinal nerves are going to exit by the foramen that's created by the intervertebral foramen, and this intervertebral foramen is only going to be present when the vertebrae are stacked on top of each other, because 2 vertebrae kind of contribute to half of the foramen of the whole. Okay, so let's now look at the meninges. The good news is, if you know the meninges for the brain, you also know the meninges for the spinal cord. They're the same thing. We have the dura mater, we have the arachnoid mater, and the pia mater. So dura mater, again, is the tough mother. That's going to be the one on the outside. And then the arachnoid mater would be the spider one underneath that. And then the pia mater would be the very soft, delicate one that connects directly to the very outside of the spinal cord itself. Okay, so same meninges. You already know that one. Okay, so let's take a look at what it looks like in the cadaver. So here we are looking at a dissection of a cadaver, and here would be the spinal cord right here coming off of it. These would be the roots for the spinal nerves. And what's being held by the forceps, the tweezers right here, that is the dura mater. So there's your dura mater there. Okay, the tough mother, the tough outermost protective layer. Underneath that is the arachnoid mater. The space that is created between the arachnoid mater and the pia mater would be the subarachnoid space. So similar idea is what we already saw for the brain. So we're missing one that I haven't shown you yet. So where would the pia mater be? If you look carefully, the spinal cord has a shiny kind of membrane type structure on the outside of that. That is the pia mater. And the pia mater directly connects and lines all of the crevices and everything directly on the spinal cord itself. Again, just like the brain. So know it once, know it twice. Good. Okay, so when you take a transverse section, also known as a cross section, so if you take your column and you cut it in half horizontally like that and look at it on its side, one thing I hope that you notice right away is that there's a different sort of scheme for the white matter versus the gray matter. Where was the gray matter found for the brain? Gray matter, most of the gray matter is found on the outside that creates the cerebral cortex. Some of them are floating islands, the nuclei inside, but most of it kind of follows the outside in the cortex. For the spinal cord, however, it's kind of switched. Instead of having the gray matter on the outside and the white matter on the inside, we now have the gray matter on the inside and the white matter on the outside. Okay, so now we have the inside here. For me, the gray matter creates a structure that looks to me like a butterfly. That's how I kind of remember it. So this yellow part right here, that would be the gray matter inside. And the gray matter creates what are called horns. Okay, so there's two, most of the spinal cord has 2 types of horns. We have the dorsal horn, which would be on the posterior side. Remember, dorsal means back. So dorsal side has a dorsal horn. And then the ventral side, again, the anterior side, that would have the ventral horn there. Okay, so one thing to kind of note right off the bat is that orientation of the spinal cord is incredibly important because most of the names have some sort of orientation, kind of directional term in them. So it's very important that you make sure that you note the orientation first. So let's look at some of the strategies. And one of the strategies is the shape of those horns. For the ventral horns, they will be skinnier and sharper, and they extend all the way to the edge of the spinal cord. So this skinny sharp part, these would be the dorsal horns. And down here, this would be the ventral horn. Okay, so B here would be the ventral horn. It's shallower, wider, and kind of more round. That's going to be the ventral horn. Okay, so that the shape of the horns is going to be one way to kind of differentiate between dorsal and ventral side. And then the second way to identify, kind of orient yourself, is to look for a deeper groove. And remember that deep grooves for the nervous system are called fissures. And so this deep groove on this side right here, so that would be this right here, so that would be D in this picture here. That would be the ventral median fissure. Ventral median fissure, median because it's right in the middle, like medial. Okay? Okay, so those are the two strategies that I use to help orient myself from there. And then I just remember that the gray matter is our horns. Now, the white matter, those are going to be called funiculi. If it's singular, it would be funiculus. Okay, so funiculus. So for example, you could say that A here, this right here would be the dorsal funiculus, one single one. If you're talking about all of them together, so the plural version, that would be funiculi. That's plural. Okay, so the white matter are funiculi and the gray matter will be horns. And then from there, you just need to orient yourself and put that name in front of it. You're good. One last structure we need to mention is the central canal. The central canal is a canal that runs through the very center, just like it says. And what do you think is inside of that central canal? That would be cerebral spinal fluid, which is the same exact fluid that we saw that was created in the ventricles of the brain, the cavities of the brain. They have cerebral spinal fluid. The same fluid also runs through the central canal of the spinal cord. Okay, now let's talk a little bit about what all this means. So remember that for when you look at the neuron, you have the cell body with the dendrites, and then you have the axons. And the cell body and the dendrites receive and synapse with each other, whereas the axons send information away. And so the gray matter for the nervous system is going to contain the cell bodies, and again, they're little dendrites as well. And so when we look at it, remember that those horns are going to contain cell bodies. So what I want to do right now is just to quickly go through a reflex arc, and that's going to demonstrate the location of where those cell bodies will be found. I will talk about this more when we get to the senses and general senses later on. Okay, so let's look at it real quick. So the first thing is, remember that when we look at here is the spinal cord here. Outside of the spinal cord, this is called the dorsal root ganglion. I'm going to talk about that when we get to the peripheral nervous system. That's going to contain those sensory neurons. Okay, so what would be the structural classification of this particular type of neuron? Okay, so when you look at it, the structural classification of neurons, remember we talked about that in the overview of the nervous system lecture. It has to do with the number of processes that connect with the cell body itself. Okay, so here's the cell body, only one single one connects, and so this would be an example of a unipolar neuron. Okay, so we have the unipolar neuron, and so here would be the receiving input coming through, and then it would send off, and so here would be the axon terminals, and then they're going to synapse with an interneuron. And remember, inter means between. So the cell bodies of the interneurons are going to be found in the dorsal horn. Okay, so we have the sensory information coming in, that's going to synapse with interneurons in the dorsal horn. And then the motor neurons, the cell bodies of the motor neurons that bring information out, commands outwards to the body, that go to things like muscles, those are going to be found in the ventral horn. So one way to sort of summarize all these complex ideas is just to remember that the dorsal side of the spinal cord is related to sensory input going in, and the ventral or anterior side, the front side, that's going to be related to motor information going out. That's going to be very helpful for your homework. Okay, so gray matter contains cell bodies and white matter contains axons. Remember that those axons, their job is to send information away. They connect different parts of the body. So the white matter, those are going to be the funiculi. So you have the dorsal, the ventral, and the lateral funiculi, or funiculus if it's singular, and they're going to communicate with the brain. So when you look at the funiculi, they're going to be kind of separated into different tracks. Okay, so tracks just means axons moving in a particular direction. We have ascending tracks. Ascending just means taking information up towards the brain. That's going to be sensory information that needs to go to the brain for processing there, and perception and processing. And then descending tracks, and their job is to take motor information away from the brain out towards effector cells. Effector cells, things like muscles, like contracting muscles and things like that. Okay, so those are going to be located in the funiculi. Okay, let's go through a couple of structures of the spinal cord and then we're almost done. For the spinal cord tapers off at the end and it creates a cone-like structure. And so this is called the conus medullaris. Medullaris as in like medulla, like middle, and conus because it's a cone shape. Okay, so this right here, this would be the conus medullaris. The conus medullaris is then connected to the bone, the coccyx, by the filum terminale. So filum as in filament, as in like a thread, like a cord, and terminale just like the end of it. Okay, so it anchors the end of the spinal cord to the coccyx so that it stays in place. And then coming off of the conus medullaris, which would be part of the spinal cord, you have a whole collection of spinal nerves. And so notice how the spinal nerves kind of continue on even past the end of the spinal nerve, past the end of the spinal cord. And thus collectively they look like a little horse's tail. And so those are called quada equina, like equestrian, like horses, quada, like tail. So quada equina just means the horse's tail it's at the end of the spinal cord, and those are made up again of spinal nerves that exit off of the end of the spinal cord. Okay, last little slide here. I also wanted to point out that when we talked about the meninges, you remember you have the dura mater, the arachnoid mater, and the pia mater. One structural difference between the spinal cord and the brain is that for the spinal cord, the dura mater is not directly connected to the brain. So for example, in the brain, you have the dura mater kind of stuck close to the skull. For the spinal cord, there's a space in there. And so that space is going to be called the epidural space. Remember that epi means above, okay? So remember we've talked about epi several times at this point. So epi, outermost, above, and then just above, the space above the epidural. So an epidural, so if you've ever given birth or you have had major surgery on, lower extremities, you can get an epidural. And what an epidural means, it just means that they insert this needle here with a little catheter. And what that does is that you just inject some local anesthesia, and that just makes it so that those spinal nerves coming off of the spinal cord are anesthetized. They block this nerve signal so that they can't send information back and forth. And that's going to decrease some of the sensation, and that's helpful for pain. So a lot of people get that when they're giving birth. Okay, that's the end of it. Bye.